I'm Professor Jason Donev. I teach physics and energy issues at the University of Calgary in Canada. I am also the chief editor for energyeducation.ca. Please check us out. We're quite proud of the work we do there. I'm also the official mad scientist for Tyche Books, a Canadian science fiction and fantasy publishing house. I also suggest you check out Tyche Books. This series of talks was put together for the Canadian Nuclear Society and International Nuclear Science Week. I hope you enjoy our exploration through science fiction and science fact. Here we see Albrecht Anker's famous painting, Grandfather Telling a Story. Note that there is a speaker, grandfather, and the children that are listening. Why are humans telling stories? Humans are creatures of story. Our identity, our emotional processing, how we perceive ourselves as part of a group, all boils down to the stories that we share. Sharing a story allows us to feel connected, and in the absence of a story, we feel alone. Humans require story to be human, as Terry Pratchett said in Hogfather. But more than that, humans process the reality around them. The truths that we hold dear in our lives come to us through story. As Anthony de Mello said, a rather famous Jesuit priest and psychotherapist, the shortest distance between a human and the truth is a story. So what are we doing here? Science fiction is specifically a class of stories that deal with science and technology, but more deeply than that, they deal with our relationship to science and technology. What do I mean by that? Well, for the past 120, 150 years, we have seen technology grow and change our lives at an unprecedented rate. Science fiction isn't really about the technology. It's about how people interact with that technology. It's about who we are in the face of these rapid technological changes. This means that, broadly speaking, much of science fiction can be thrown into two categories. Sometimes it fits in both, and sometimes it's neither, but there's two broad categories. One type of science fiction story sets humans or non-humans in a world that is very clearly not our world. This allows us to take a step back from what's happening and serve through satire or other methods to look at the fundamental truths that are in our lives in a way that we can't see because we're too emotionally invested in the world in which we live in. This distancing kind of story works very well within science fiction because creating a different place is very easy to do with science fiction. Now, the other broad category of science fiction is one in which we are specifically looking at, if this piece of technology changes, who are we as people in this new world with this technological change? Now, what this means is that oftentimes science fiction has accurately predicted the future, sometimes in creepy and eerie ways. Join us for this series of videos where I will be exploring a number of different science fiction stories and science fiction facts, or rather science fiction that turned into fact, as a way of seeing how is our perception of science and technology shaped by the stories that we tell. Our travels begin in the 18th century. Our travels are going to specifically begin with that wonderful traveler, Gulliver. In 1726, Swift wrote a beautiful, biting satire piece called Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver goes around and deals with different societies. This is a wonderful example of the type of science fiction story that I'm talking about, where you place people in a new situation in order to see what's fundamental about the humanity. But it's also something where you are putting people in something that is clearly not their situation as a way of saying, oh, this is a truth about them. Oh, this is also a truth about me. The Laputans wind up studying math and music and astronomy, but they can't apply it to anything useful. This is the biting commentary. Now, the astronomy that they're studying actually discovers that Mars has 2 moons. This is in 1726, 150 years before Hall discovers that Mars does in fact have 2 moons, Phobos, fear, and Deimos, panic. Now, after Voltaire, but well before the discovery of the actual, well before the discovery of the actual moons, but well after Swift wrote, Voltaire also wrote what I would consider to be a science fiction story, although most people would consider it a philosophical discourse. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. Micromegas actually talks about huge, giant alien creatures coming to Earth and trying to figure out what makes a person a person. And in the process of doing this, the characters within Micromegas talk about the fact that Mars has 2 moons. Coincidence? Absolutely. Why is it science fiction? Well, it's science dealing with who we are as people. But there is this eerie coincidence of there actually being 2 moons for Mars. Skipping now to 1897, I'm sorry to have missed some of your favorite stories. I know we're having to skip some of mine, but our time is limited. H.G. Wells' classic book, The War of the Worlds, the first in-depth treatment of what alien invasion would look like and mean. It was xenophobia, inspiring and reaction. It's also the first time we talk about mechanized warfare, something that 20 years later would become really, really important in World War I. It also outlines the heat ray, which functionally is really a laser beam in a lot of ways. But what is H.G. Wells really talking about? This is an example, in my mind, of how a science fiction story tells the story of someone from a perspective that people aren't expecting. It's talking about Britons being subject to a superior technology invading their area. They're killed indiscriminately. They don't understand what the aliens want. Their entire world is suddenly turned upside down. And the way that they wind up winning in the end, spoiler alert, it's disease. Human diseases wind up wiping out the Martians. But what was H.G. Wells really talking about? Well, in my opinion, H.G. Wells was really talking about British colonialism. Advanced technology showing up with guns and ships, killing people indiscriminately, destroying cultures of the local, with the aliens coming in with some nefarious, unidentifiable reason. This was a way for H.G. Wells to get people to see someone else's world through their own eyes. This was really, really current. Science fiction is always about the present. What was H.G. Wells really trying to do? He was trying to allow people to see through their own eyes the experience of someone else, so their perspective could get broader. Stories provide the opportunity for compassion. Continuing to talk about H.G. Wells, in 1933, the book, The Shape of Things to Come, which H.G. Wells later worked on the screenplay for the movie in 1936, The Shape of Things to Come, is a vast, sweeping depiction of the future of humanity. But it starts with the prediction that in January of 1940, Germany and Poland would get into a war. When did it actually happen? September 1939. He was off by 4 months. He also predicted in this book that the US and Japan would fight extensively. He predicted the bombing of cities, something that had been unthinkable to most people in 1933. But when you roll forward to World War II just a few years later, that's exactly what happened. H.G. Wells was writing about the present. He was writing about the tensions that he saw and felt, and was trying to communicate, this is what I see happening if we continue to do what we're doing. Now, from a technical perspective, he also predicted wrist communicators. It's interesting that Dick Tracy didn't get his until 1946, quite a bit later, after the creator of Dick Tracy talked to an inventor and said, oh, wouldn't it be neat? But science fiction was already predicting that we would have personal communication devices that we carry with us that allow us to talk with people elsewhere wirelessly. In 1933, that's quite a prediction. I myself am more scared by the fact that he was able to predict World War II. Rolling back just a bit, Robert Cromie in 1895, a contemporary of H.G. Wells, wrote The Crack of Doom. From the title, you can probably correctly guess that that book is talking about a lot of the fear, resentment, and even some of the grief that will cloud some of science fiction in the coming century. His character, Branda, rather famously says, "No man can say to science, 'This far, no farther.' No man ever has, no man ever shall." Now, interestingly, what he's talking about at that point is an atomic microscope, which more than 100 years later is what I got my PhD using. Robert Cromie fascinatingly talks about breaking up molecular energy, but what it really seems to boil down to when you look at it in depth is he's predicting something frighteningly similar to a nuclear bomb. In 1895, the nucleus hasn't even been discovered yet, but he's still predicting a nuclear bomb. But this isn't nearly as frightening as what H.G. Wells predicted in The World Set Free. Keeping in mind that the real atomic bomb doesn't detonate until the summer of 1945. In 1914, H.G. Wells predicted a sustained atomic reaction, that it was a chain reaction. He predicted the mushroom cloud. He predicted the radioactive ruin. He also seems to have been read by Leo Szilard, the man who took out the patent with the British Admiralty on the nuclear bomb process. The book goes on, though, because remember, stories are about people and how we think about and feel about the world around us. So, H.G. Wells also, in that book, talks about the moral and ethical hazards associated with a bomb that he believed was capable of leveling a city. Remember, Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard themselves only believed that it would be capable of leveling a port. Leo Szilard went on to be one of the first anti-nuclear activists. Interesting for a man who developed the nuclear bomb's original ideas. But Leo Szilard is a human being who processed the world through his stories. Radiation has turned out to be a powerful tool in our society, and we will explore in the next video how radiation and other technology has shifted over the course of the past 100 or so years, and how our stories have reflected that shift. I hope you'll join us.